The first time someone called us perfect, I laughed into my coffee and almost spilled it across the kitchen counter. It was a lazy Sunday morning, sunlight slanting through the blinds in soft, forgiving lines, the kind of light that makes everything look warmer than it really is. Ethan stood behind me, arms loosely around my waist, chin resting on my shoulder as he reached past me to grab a mug. He smelled like soap and sleep. The moment felt so ordinary and so right that I didn't question it. Perfect sounded like a compliment you accepted without inspecting too closely. We had that kind of relationship people like to point at. The kind that looks good from the outside. We met at a friend's game night 2 years earlier, bonded over terrible jokes and an unspoken agreement that we both hated small talk. Our first date lasted 6 hours because neither of us wanted to be the one to leave. When we moved in together, it felt less like a leap and more like a continuation, as if we were just stepping into the next room of a house we'd already been living in. Mornings were our quiet ritual. He woke up before me most days, humming under his breath while the kettle boiled. I'd wake to the sound of cabinets opening and closing, to the smell of coffee drifting into the bedroom like an invitation. Sometimes he'd bring me a mug in bed, whispering, "Don't fall back asleep," as if he didn't secretly love it when I did. We shared playlists for everything, cooking, driving, cleaning, arguing over song order but never over what we liked. We had inside jokes so layered they barely made sense to anyone else. We finished each other's sentences, not because it was cute, but because it was easy. My parents adored him. My mother smiled the second he walked into a room, the way mothers do when they think their daughter has found something safe. My father shook his hand with approval that lingered just a second longer than necessary. Ethan noticed these things and played his part effortlessly. He brought wine, helped with dishes, asked the right questions. When my friends teased me about how lucky I was, I brushed it off with a shrug, pretending I didn't secretly agree. If there were cracks, they were small enough to hide in the glow of everything else. He joked sometimes about my clinginess when I asked him to text me when he got home late. He rolled his eyes when I talked too long about work, telling me I overthought everything. When I mentioned the future, nothing dramatic, just passing comments about trips we might take or what kind of house we'd like, he smiled but changed the subject. I told myself this was normal. People moved at different speeds. Love wasn't a race. Once, at a friend's engagement party, someone asked when it would be our turn. Ethan laughed and lifted his drink in a mock toast, saying, "One step at a time." I laughed too, even though something in my chest tightened just a little. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I asked him what he thought our life would look like in 5 years. He sighed, not annoyed exactly, but tired, and said, "Why do we have to plan everything? Can't we just enjoy what we have?" I apologized for pushing. He kissed my forehead. The moment passed. I became good at explaining him. To myself, mostly. Ethan wasn't afraid of commitment, he was just cautious. He wasn't dismissive, he was joking. He loved me, he just didn't show it the same way I did. Love meant compromise, didn't it? It meant patience. It meant understanding that people had histories and fears you couldn't see. There were nights when we sat on the couch, legs tangled, watching old movies and eating straight from the carton because we didn't feel like washing bowls. He'd rest his head on my lap, eyes half closed, and I'd run my fingers through his hair, thinking, this is it. This is the life people mean when they talk about settling down. Not dramatic declarations or grand gestures, just the steady comfort of knowing someone was there. Once, during a power outage, we lit candles and played cards on the floor. Shadows danced on the walls, and he laughed so hard at a joke I made that he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said casually, like it was obvious. I carried that sentence with me for months, pulling it out whenever doubt crept in. But doubt has a way of whispering when you least expect it. It showed up in small moments, like when he'd introduce me as my girlfriend with a tone that felt more like a label than a choice, or when he avoided conversations that felt too real. Once, after a long day, I told him I needed reassurance, just a little. He hugged me, but his arms felt distracted, his mind elsewhere. "You worry too much," he said gently. "We're good." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. So I learned to soften my questions, to swallow my expectations, to tell myself that love didn't need guarantees. I watched friends get engaged, married, start families, and I told myself our timeline was just different. There was no rush. We were happy. Weren't we? The night everything shifted started like any other. I went out to dinner with a friend, complaining about nothing important, laughing about things that wouldn't matter tomorrow. I came home earlier than planned, keys quiet in my hand as I opened the door. The apartment was dim, the living room lit by the glow of a laptop screen. I heard Ethan's voice before I saw him, loud and relaxed, the sound of someone completely at ease. I stopped in the hallway, not meaning to listen, just pausing to kick off my shoes. His laughter carried through the space, joined by other voices through the speakers. It sounded like a moment I didn't belong to, a private version of him I rarely saw. I smiled, thinking I'd surprise him, maybe tease him for being too loud. Then I heard my name. I didn't know yet that this was the moment everything I thought I understood would rearrange itself. I didn't know that the life I believed we were building was already cracking beneath the surface. All I knew, standing there in the quiet of our shared hallway, was that something in his tone felt different, lighter in a way that made my stomach drop. Up until that second, I had thought love was about believing the picture you were shown. I had thought that if something looked perfect long enough, it must be real. I hadn't yet learned how wrong that assumption could be. The night of Laughter Hook, I wasn't supposed to hear it. But once I did, I couldn't unhear it. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, my hand still wrapped around my keys, the metal pressing into my palm. The carpet beneath my feet felt suddenly foreign, like I was standing in someone else's home. Ethan's laughter echoed again, louder this time, sharp and careless. It wasn't the laugh he used with me, the soft one, reserved for shared moments. This one was loose, unguarded. Performative. I leaned slightly toward the living room, not fully stepping in. The laptop sat open on the coffee table, angled just enough for me to see his reflection in the darkened screen. He was sprawled on the couch, one arm draped over the backrest, comfortable in the way people get when they believe they're unseen. "Man, you've been with her forever," one of the voices said through the speakers. I didn't recognize who it was, but there were at least 4 people on the call. "So what's the plan? When's the wedding?" The question hung in the air for half a second. Just long enough for my heart to lift, foolishly, before it dropped. Ethan snorted. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward pause. He laughed like the question itself was ridiculous. "Wedding?" he repeated, as if tasting the word. Then he said it. "I'd rather die than marry her." The room erupted. Laughter exploded through the speakers, overlapping voices, whistles, someone clapping. My ears rang. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard him right. My brain tried to soften the words, reshape them into something less brutal. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe it was sarcasm. Maybe he'd follow it up with a joke that made it clear he didn't mean it. He didn't. Someone said, "Damn," still laughing. Another voice added, "Cold, bro." Ethan grinned. I could see it now. That smirk, the one he wore when he felt clever, untouchable. "I mean, she's great," he said casually, like he was discussing a restaurant he liked but wouldn't recommend. "But marriage? Nah. That's not happening. The laughter continued, softer now, satisfied. They moved on, talking about something else, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The words had lodged themselves inside me, sharp and immovable. I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming shallow, as if the air had thickened without warning. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my keys or make a sound. I stood there, perfectly still, watching the man I loved joke about my future like it was a burden he'd narrowly avoided. A strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes when something finally makes sense. All the moments I'd brushed aside lined up neatly in my mind, the jokes, the eye rolls, the way he dodged every serious conversation. This wasn't fear. This wasn't needing more time. This was contempt dressed up as charm. I stepped back slowly, careful not to let the floor creak. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, but he didn't look up. I moved toward the bedroom, every step deliberate, like I was walking through water. Inside, I closed the door without a sound and leaned against it. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror across the room. I looked normal. No tears streaking my face. No visible cracks. Just a woman standing very still, holding herself together through sheer will. I thought about all the times I'd defended him. All the explanations I'd offered on his behalf. He's just not ready. He doesn't mean it like that. He loves me, he just shows it differently. The realization settled heavily, he had meant it exactly as he said it. And he hadn't cared who heard. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting uselessly in my lap. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my friend asking if I'd made it home safely. I stared at the screen and then turned it face down. I wasn't ready to explain. I wasn't ready to say the words out loud, to make them real. From the living room, Ethan laughed again, this time at something unrelated. The sound felt obscene, like a violation. I wondered how long he'd felt this way. Had he ever imagined a future with me at all? Or had I just been convenient? Comfortable. Temporary. Anger flickered briefly, hot and tempting. I imagined storming into the room, demanding answers, forcing him to look at me while I repeated his words back to him. I imagined watching his face change, seeing panic replace arrogance. But the image faded as quickly as it came. What would that give me? An apology he didn't mean? An explanation that wouldn't undo what I'd heard? I realized, with startling clarity, that nothing he could say would make those words disappear. They were already part of me now. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing familiar cracks with my eyes. This room had held so many versions of us, lazy Sundays, whispered conversations, nights where I fell asleep believing I was loved in the way that mattered. Now it felt like a set after the actors had left, props arranged to suggest a story that no longer existed. Time passed strangely after that. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. At some point, the laughter in the living room died down, and the apartment fell quiet. I heard the laptop close. Footsteps approached the bedroom door and then stopped. He knocked lightly. "Hey," he said, his voice soft again, familiar. "You home?" I didn't answer. There was a pause. Then he shrugged it off, I could tell by the sound of his footsteps retreating. He didn't push. He never did. I lay there long after the lights went out, my eyes open in the dark. Ethan's breathing eventually deepened beside me when he came to bed, steady and untroubled. He slept easily, like someone who hadn't just shattered another person's world with a sentence he thought was funny. I stared into the darkness and understood something I'd never let myself consider before. Love isn't just about how someone treats you when you're alone together. It's about how they speak of you when you're not there to hear it. And that night, In the quiet space between his breaths, I accepted a truth that would change everything. The man lying next to me did not see a future with me in it. He never had. I didn't fall asleep. I didn't need to. By morning, I already knew what I was going to do. The silent goodbye hook. He thought silence meant weakness. He was wrong. Morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic wake-up, no tears spilling onto the pillow. Just light creeping through the curtains, pale and indifferent, illuminating the room as if nothing had changed. Ethan slept on, sprawled comfortably on his side, one arm flung across my pillow like he owned the space I occupied. I watched him for a moment, searching for something, remorse, maybe, or a trace of the boy I thought I loved. There was nothing. Just a man sleeping peacefully after laughing about a future he never planned to share with me. I slid out of bed quietly. The floor was cold beneath my feet, grounding me. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection again. My eyes looked clearer than I expected. Focused. It unsettled me how calm I felt, how quickly something inside me had hardened into resolve. I brushed my teeth, tied my hair back, and breathed. Not deeply. Just steadily. The apartment felt different now. Not hostile, exactly, just hollow. Like a place I'd already left in my mind. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, noticing small details I'd never paid attention to before, the chipped corner of the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the way the morning light fell unevenly across the floor. This space had been ours. Or so I'd thought. I didn't wake him. I didn't feel the need to. Packing wasn't dramatic. No frantic throwing of clothes into bags. No sobbing pauses. I moved methodically, starting with my dresser. Fold. Stack. Place. Each item felt like a memory passing through my hands. The sweater I'd borrowed from him and never returned. The dress I wore to that engagement party. The t-shirt with paint stains from the time we tried to redecorate the living room and gave up halfway through. I carried boxes into the hallway one by one, careful not to make noise. The silence felt intentional, almost sacred. This wasn't an escape. It was a decision. As I packed, moments replayed themselves without invitation. His voice telling me I worried too much. The way he'd sigh when I asked where things were going. The laughter from the night before, echoing louder now that everything else was quiet. I didn't fight the memories. I let them come and go, like proof. Halfway through, I paused in the living room. The couch still held the faint impression of where he'd sat during the call. The laptop was gone, but the space remembered. I stood there longer than I meant to, my arms wrapped around myself, feeling the weight of what I was leaving behind. Not him. Me. The version of myself who had shrunk her needs to make room for his comfort. The girl who mistook patience for love and silence for safety. I picked up my keys from the counter and hesitated. My spare key lay beside them, the one he'd given me with a smile months ago. In case, he'd said. I placed it back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter. A small, deliberate act. In the bedroom, I took one last look around. It felt strange not to feel sentimental. No urge to linger. No dramatic goodbye. Just clarity. I left the door open when I walked out. The front door closed behind me with a soft click. Outside, the air felt sharper, cooler. Like I'd stepped into a different version of the day. I loaded the last box into my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands resting on my lap. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my friend. I typed back simply, "Can I stay with you for a bit?" The reply came almost immediately. Of course. I drove away without looking back. Hours passed before Ethan noticed. I imagined him waking slowly, stretching, wandering into the kitchen expecting coffee. Calling my name casually. Confusion setting in as he realized the apartment was too quiet. I didn't picture his panic. Just his surprise. When my phone buzzed again, his name lit up the screen. "Where are you?" the message read. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I put the phone face down and kept driving. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. Silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was choosing not to beg someone to understand what they'd already shown they didn't value. That night, in a room that wasn't mine but felt safe, I slept deeply. No dreams. No regrets. Just rest. I didn't know what the next weeks would bring. I didn't need to. I'd already done the hardest part. I had left. The weight of absence hook, sometimes silence says what words never could. The first few days after I left felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's life wearing my own face. I stayed with my friend in her small, sunlit apartment, sleeping on a couch that creaked every time I moved. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. She just handed me tea, made space, and let the quiet do its work. Ethan didn't give the quiet that same respect. The calls started that afternoon. One missed call. Then two. Then a text, "Are you okay?" Another, "Where did you go?" By evening, the messages grew longer, layered with confusion and irritation. "This isn't funny. If you're mad, we should talk." I read them all without responding, my chest tight but my resolve steady. By the second day, his tone shifted. The irritation softened into concern. "I'm worried about you. You can't just disappear like this." I wondered if he heard the irony in that sentence. Probably not. On the third day, he showed up at my friend's door. I wasn't home, but she told me later how he stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, running a hand through his hair like he always did when he didn't know what to say. He asked if I was there. She said no. He asked if I was okay. She said that was for me to answer. When I got back that night, I sat on the edge of the couch, my phone heavy in my hands. I considered replying. Just one message. Something simple. "I'm safe. I need space." But every version of a response felt like an opening I wasn't ready to give him. So I stayed silent. Silence does strange things to people who are used to being heard. It forces them to sit with themselves. To replay moments without interruption. To wonder. Days turned into weeks. His messages came in waves. Some were light, almost playful, like he could charm his way back into my life if he found the right tone. You'd laugh if you saw how messy the place is without you. Others were heavier, apologies wrapped in self-defense. I didn't mean it like that. You know how my friends joke. I was just messing around. But there was one thing he never said. He never denied the words. That told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened to me. The constant tightness in my chest eased. I woke up without that familiar knot of anticipation, wondering what version of him I'd get that day. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I met friends without checking my phone every 10 minutes. I laughed without immediately wanting to share the moment with someone else. Peace, I learned, is quiet but heavy. It settles into your bones. Ethan felt the absence in ways he hadn't anticipated. He still had the apartment, the routines, the job. But the small things unraveled. There were no notes on the counter. No playlists updating themselves. No one reminding him of the details he forgot. The warmth he'd taken for granted evaporated, leaving behind an echo. He sent one last message that stood out from the rest. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. He hadn't thought I was capable of choosing myself. And that, more than anything, made me glad I had. I never replied. Weeks later, I ran into him by accident at a cafe near my friend's place. I was standing in line, distracted, when I felt it, that awareness you get when someone familiar enters a room. I turned, and there he was, frozen mid-step, surprise written plainly across his face. He looked tired. Smaller somehow. "Hey," he said softly. "Hi," I replied. My voice didn't shake. We stood there awkwardly, the space between us filled with things unsaid. Finally, he spoke. "You could have at least said goodbye." I smiled then. Not cruelly. Not sadly. Just calmly. "You already did." Understanding flickered across his face, too late to matter. I took my coffee and walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd won. Not because he'd lost. But because I had rescued myself. I used to think love was about holding on. Now I know real love starts when you finally let go.